We begin by introducing Dr. James McCoon, who is on his way to a remote town called Norfolk at the invitation of his uncle, who needs his medical services. On the way, he loses his horse and has to make a quick stop as night falls. At that moment, he encounters a strange man named Micah, who offers to accompany him. Micah asks if James has been with a man named Joe, and James explains that he is traveling alone. Despite the courteous exchanges, the conversation quickly becomes hostile when James says goodbye. Micah accuses James of having the gemstones, but the doctor doesn't know what he is talking about. Micah restrains James in search of the stones, but he manages to push the man away. A mysterious red mist spreads through the forest, and something invisible drags Micah away. Faced with the surreal situation, James flees in panic until he reaches the walls of Norfolk, banging on the wood until a gatekeeper, Dovey, lets him in after hearing his name. Inside the walls, Dovey informs James that his uncle is waiting for him and that traveling during the day would be much safer. The doctor enters a tavern run by a blind bartender, Torb, and his beloved Lucille. A man warmly greets him. It's Douglas, who used to be the previous newcomer and is now the town's photographer, tailor, and hat specialist. James notices the images decorating the bar, depicting the dangers of Norfolk, and Douglas asks if he has seen any ghosts. James seems uncertain, and Douglas confirms that no one is sure. Shortly after, someone asks Torb to demonstrate his skill, and a customer places a chess piece on a table, while Lucille clicks her tongue to activate Torb's ability. Douglas says goodbye to James, offering an invitation to visit his shop. Alone, James asks Torb about his ability, and the bartender humbly states that it is merely a party trick. Jesse appears and takes James away unenthusiastically, saying that his uncle is waiting for him at home. Before leaving, James inquires about rooms for rent, and Torb offers him one option. Soon, James reunites with Matthew, his uncle who runs the town. The two catch up affectionately, with James expressing his admiration for the harmonious town and its abundant resources. Matthew comments that the town values usefulness over physical appearance, with no racial distinctions, something they do not experience in the outside world. As they talk, James recounts the peculiar event he experienced outside the walls, which Matthew confirms as ghosts, accompanied by the red mist. Even though he does not believe, James listens to Matthew insist that they are real, but he reassures him that they are safe within the walls. Matthew provides James with an overview of Norfolk, which will soon celebrate its 25th anniversary, and talks about a clinic he is setting up. The next morning, James observes the town's hunters, Annie and her brother William, tall and strong. After lunch, Mick, a widowed sympathizer, shows James the town, pointing the way to his clinic. On the way, they see Jesse giving a sermon to Joe, the man mentioned by Micah. A man passes by pulling a small covered cart, and peering in, James discovers Micah's body. The man claims that the ghosts got him. Upon arriving at his clinic, James quickly settles in, receiving a home consultation letter from his first patient, the local teacher, Mrs. Roberts. She has a severe cough, but only asks about an ugly burn she suffered from a teapot. James says he can check the cough, but Mrs. Roberts explains that the last doctor couldn't cure her, so she believes it is because of chalk. James demonstrates great knowledge by identifying that the cause of her cough is an allergy to pollen. That night, a deafening scream echoes from outside the walls, and he rushes to the gate, which is unguarded. He finds Joe, bloodied and fleeing, with his tongue cut off. James renders immediate medical assistance, cauterizing his tongue to stop the bleeding. As Joe passes out, James takes advantage of the momentary calm to clean the spilled blood, finding a small bag of Joe's with gemstones. Joe wakes up in a panic and quickly snatches the bag from James's hands before fleeing. Although James tries to stop him from leaving, his wound on the left arm makes it difficult. Later that day, James visits Douglas's hat shop, who offers to sew a coat and a fancier hat for him. James also expresses interest in a camera from Douglas that he has never seen before. While looking at the photos Douglas took, he comes across an image of the former doctor of the town and asks about his predecessor. No one knows for sure why he left the town. Douglas reveals his fascination with the mysteries surrounding Norfolk, explaining that the residents treat the ghosts as a religion, while his goal is to capture them in photographs. During their conversation, James learns that Annie, one of the hunters, kept the clinic running after the departure of the previous doctor, and he plans to visit her in hopes of hiring her as an assistant. However, Douglas comments that the brothers live outside the walls. When James tries to exit through the gate to visit the hunters, Dovey stops him, explaining that no one can leave without Matthew's permission. But James manages to convince him, expressing his need to see Annie. Arriving at the humble home of the siblings, James communicates his objective to hire her, but Annie shows no interest in taking on 2 jobs. Nevertheless, James insists on his offer. One day, Matthew visits James, requesting an old recipe from the previous doctor that helped people sleep. When James mentions that he tried to hire Annie, Matthew disapproves of the idea, stating that Annie has a clear purpose as a hunter. He eventually relents, as long as Annie can balance both roles at the same time. Matthew then notices the blood stains from Joe and questions James about it, recalling the details of that night. His demeanor changes as he becomes disappointed that James did not report the incident immediately, explaining that the ghosts were responsible for Joe's attack. Although James remains skeptical about the supernatural, he decides to give his uncle the benefit of the doubt. Changing the subject, James mentions he will work on the dye, but upon reading the recipe, he becomes concerned about the strong solution. He suggests to Matthew that he could create a better sleeping medicine, but his uncle is inflexible about the recipe. Quickly, James leaves the walls in search of mushrooms for the recipe, but the red mist appears suddenly. It sends him into a deep sleep, and before passing out, James sees Joe desperately fleeing from the ghosts. After this distressing event, James goes to Torb's bar to recover. The next morning, he is surprised by Annie and William, the Hunter siblings, who are at the door of his clinic, as Annie accepted his offer. Soon, a patient arrives, Jesse's niece, who sprained her wrist after falling from a tree. After resetting the wrist, James advises the girl to avoid climbing trees for a while. Annie questions James about why he said that, as her arm will be fine in 2 or 3 days. In response, James explains that he wants to prevent the girl from leaving the walls, which causes a slight frustration in Annie, who argues that ghosts should not be feared. Days pass, and James integrates into the community, frequenting Torb's bar and keeping his promise to teach Annie some medical skills. During a suturing lesson, James asks why William doesn't speak, and Annie reveals that he has not uttered a word since their father's death, whose last words were "stay silent." That night, while James and Annie share drinks, Mick appears and suggests that Annie join his house to fill the void left by the death of his wife, but she immediately refuses, not seeing herself as a housewife. After Mick walks away, they address the topic of James's left arm injury, which he suffered during the Civil War when he was ambushed by Confederates. They wrapped his arm with barbed wire and dragged him for nearly a mile. Because of the injury, he accepted his uncle's invitation to Norfolk, considering himself useless anywhere else. He asks Annie to keep this a secret, as he has not mentioned it to Matthew, which irritates Annie, who believes James should not be judged for his scars, as he is a good doctor. Annie warns him to be careful, stating that the town is not safe, and that by breaking a rule, he could be punished by the ghosts. James retorts that his life isn't any better outside, and turns the question, asking why she hasn't left if she believes the town is so bad. She replies that the town wouldn't let her go, revealing that the ghosts killed the previous doctor when he tried to leave, calling Norfolk a prison. After a brief argument, James apologizes and goes to bed, leaving Annie alone, who also decides to return home. Before she can exit the walls, she is ambushed and dragged into the clinic, where 2 men brutally assault her. She fights back with her hunting knife and manages to escape. William finds her bleeding and takes her to the tavern, where James, Lucille, and Torb gather to care for her. The next morning, James tries to ask about what happened, but Annie refuses to respond, telling William that she wants to go home. As he leaves, Douglas runs after him, stating he has something important to show. Although James intends to inform Matthew about what happened, Douglas implores him to listen and takes him to his shop. On the way, they see a man dragging the bodies of Joe and Mick, claiming they were responsible for the attack on Annie and that the ghosts killed them as punishment. This heightens James's anxiety to find out what Douglas has to say. Douglas reveals that he witnessed what happened to Annie and feels ashamed for not acting, but he managed to capture a photo of the moment, showing Matthew merely observing from the clinic window. James takes the photo to Matthew, confronting him about the situation. Matthew explains that he called the ghosts to help Annie, who was attacked by Joe and Mick. However, James does not believe him, knowing that Mick wouldn't have the courage to harm Annie, whom he loved. Matthew suggests that Mick may have felt threatened by James's closeness to Annie and devised a cruel plan so that no one else would have her. Even so, James remains skeptical. James realizes that Matthew has Joe's gemstones, triggering an explosion of rage in Matthew, who screams that they are not Joe's stones. Matthew reveals that they mined diamonds and hid the riches from the town's inhabitants, who have as much right as he does. James scolds him for lying and exploiting the people, provoking a new confrontation in which Matthew criticizes James's secret about his injury. Matthew says he doesn't care about the injury itself, but about James's dishonesty about it. He argues that the ghosts help maintain order in the town, allowing him to govern a predominantly white population. Meanwhile, Annie has a nightmare about the day her father died, recalling the ghost's attack. Awakening distressed, she tells William that she needs to find James, who is on his way to visit her. The red mist begins to approach James before a ghost appears before him, causing him to lose consciousness. In the tavern, Matthew speaks with Torb, asking for his loyalty. He reveals himself as the mastermind behind everything. The attack on Annie, the death of her father, Torb's loss of sight, and most importantly, the ghosts. Torb is aware of everything but keeps the secret to maintain peace in the town, although he is irritated by what happened to Annie, and Matthew orders him to stay silent. When James wakes up, he finds his injured arm tied to a rope suspended from a tree, and soon a ghost slowly approaches him. But William appears and shoots the ghost, helping James escape. William shows James a vial of Matthew's sleeping medicine, and James pieces things together, realizing that Matthew has been using this substance in the red mist, finally understanding that Matthew has controlled everything all along and that the ghosts aren't real. They return to the siblings' house, only to find the building on fire. William quickly runs toward the house, finally recovering his voice as he calls for his sister. They return to Torb to deliver the sad news, where everyone is mourning the loss of their friend. James shares his discovery, but when Lucille admits that they already knew, William storms out in anger. James heads to the town's festivities, celebrating Norfolk's 25th anniversary, where Matthew pays tribute to the ghosts who supposedly bring justice to those who deserve it. They consider offering Douglas as a sacrifice for not respecting the ghosts. However, William appears among the crowd with a shotgun and demands that they leave Douglas alone. He is immediately captured, while James runs toward Douglas, who collapses due to critical injuries. James confronts Matthew, stating that people need to know the truth. Anticipating that James will expose him, Matthew turns the situation against him, revealing his injury and portraying him as an incompetent doctor, lying about how James was responsible for Annie's death. James tries to scream the truth to the crowd, but no one hears him, as everyone still believes that the ghosts are real. Suddenly, a ghost appears and reveals itself to be Annie, wearing the outfit they used to fool the townspeople. Annie reveals the truth, and with the evidence, people begin to believe her. Meanwhile, the tavern is attacked by Matthew's men, who attempt to set fire to the building, but Torb and Lucille join forces to neutralize the assailants one by one, working in great synchronization. Soon, Matthew spreads chaos throughout the town, while men wearing gas masks release the red mist, which is the disguised sleep agent. They band together to fight against the assailants, and some manage to escape through the gates. Matthew calls Mrs. Roberts, who is wearing a gas mask. It is discovered that she is also part of the plan and was responsible for betraying Annie on the night of her attack. When she declares that she will no longer cooperate with Matthew, he finishes her off. Annie tries to shoot Matthew, but he escapes, disappearing into the mist. He reappears outside the tavern, taking Lucille hostage to lure Torb. However, Torb bravely takes the bullets until Matthew runs out of ammunition. Seizing the opportunity, Torb attacks and manages to poke Matthew's eyes out, but then falls to the ground, dying in Lucille's arms. The next day, Annie tells James that he can become the new leader of the town, but he hesitates because of his association with Matthew. Annie argues that his name does not determine his destiny and that he is a better man than his uncle. However, they do not know that Matthew survived the attack and is hiding in the forest, with his eyes covered by a bandage.